All right, here we are. Try to get that the right screen there and get our captions going. And are they? No, they're not. Oh, I remember why. For some reason, I have to fix them in both screens, and I forget to do that. So, bear with me. Let's see if those work now. Yay! Okay, so we are back for our first reading stream in, a week? I think my voice will handle it, so I'm going to give it a try. We'll get into the 4th chapter of Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals. So, without further ado, let's just jump right into it. Let's see, it's page 62. How many pages do I have to get through here? Just so I know. 81, 19 pages. Okay, we can do that. All right, so chapter 4, The Flood. I found something oddly haunting about Tiwanaku. It seemed obvious to me that the academics were simply trying to play down the significance of one of the most puzzling sites on Earth. To date, its beginning, as Kalata did, to 100 BC seemed laughable. How could anyone accept that the original people were Indians called the Wankarani, in whose villages one would find, quote, a combination of subsistence agriculture, primarily of potato and quinoa, and camelid pastoralism, end quote. How did these simple Indians have move the giant stone blocks? On my return from South America, I found a copy of Arthur Poznański's Tiwanaku, the Cradle of American Man, on the web. The first thing I saw when I opened it was a plate showing the Gate of the Sun in 1904 before it was repaired. It was split in two, with the two halves leaning crazily against one another. It was obvious that some giant convulsion had torn it in half. This was plainly the consequence of the same earthquake that had tossed around those immense blocks of the harbor, Pumapunka. What had happened was obvious. At some time in the remote past, an immense harbor had been built, fronting on Lake Titicaca, the highest lake in the world, 12,500 feet above sea level and covering more than 3,000 square miles. Wow, I didn't know it was that big. Here, the alert reader will instantly say, wait a minute, why on earth are these people building a harbor 2.5 miles up in the air? Are they mad? The explanation that this is not a sea harbor but a lake harbor fails to satisfy. For surely a harbor is a place where ships from over the sea bring their goods for trade and exchange. How many other harbors are there on Lake Titicaca? When the answer emerges none, the whole thing begins to seem absurd, particularly when we learn that the only people to sail on Lake Titicaca are Indians in reed boats. This port has obviously been built in the wrong place. Then we learn that Lake Titicaca is full of sea creatures who have adapted to fresh water, and the obvious explanation begins to dawn. It must have been on sea level when some great convulsion raised the Andes 12,500 feet in the air. And when was that? Well, clearly it must have been in historical times, not a million or so years ago, because human beings built the harbor. In fact, Poznansky suggests the date when the catastrophe happened around the 11th millennium BC, say 11,000. That date struck a chord. Not long before, I had seen in the George C. Page Museum in Los Angeles, filming in a hall full of the bones of dead dinosaurs. In the grounds of the museum, the, quote, tar trap of La Brea still bubbles ominously. Over tens of thousands of years, thousands of animals died as they waded into the oily water to drink, then found themselves slowly engulfed in mud. But around 10,000 BC, I was told by John Harris, curator of the museum, there was a more violent catastrophe. A great earth tremor wiped out 25 species in a few years, including mastodons and saber-toothed tigers. Is it too much to assume that the same earth tremor split the great gate of Tiwanaku some 4,000 miles to the southeast, as it raised the Andes 2.5 miles above sea level? If this sounds unlikely, bear in mind that according to Hapgood, this same convulsion caused the face of the earth to slip 2,000 miles and devastated the continent Plato called Atlantis. We should note that this is not the only great flood. According to the Critias, there had been 3 floods, quote unquote, before that of Deucalion. Deucalion's legendary flood, which Zeus sent to punish the men of the Bronze Age, must have been sometime after 2500 BC. The first, I would suggest, was Hapgood's crust shift that caused the devastation of La Brea. A similar scenario is recorded in myths all over the world. For days before it happens, the sky is red and there are earth tremors. Then one day the sky turns black, the earth convulses and seems to lurch. A muddy rain falls in torrents, accompanied by deafening crashes of thunder and blinding sheet lightning. The Flemmaths are recording the legends of Native Americans, the Ute, the Kootenai, the Okanagan, the Aatem, and the Caddo, and the Cherokee, down to the Araucanians of Peru, heard almost identical tales of when the sky fell. The most famous of all such catastrophes originated in the land of the Bible, not Palestine, but Mesopotamia, the quote-unquote land of the two rivers. Early 19th century travelers who visited Mesopotamia must have been disappointed to find it so bare and unromantic. No pyramids or temples or obelisks, just an arid country of desert and dust storms, with odd-looking mounds that rose out of the brown plain like miniature volcanoes. Yet this was the land of Babylon and Nineveh and the latter the birthplace of Abraham. Europe was indifferent to such places until 1815, when a book called Memoir on the Ruins of Babylon caused widespread excitement and made its brilliant young author famous. His name was Claudius Rich, and his adventures had started when he was 16. He had been shipwrecked on his way to Egypt, where he was about to take up a job with the East India Company. He finally arrived at Smyrna in Turkey by way of Malta and Italy. Disguised as a Turk and speaking fluent Arabic, he then journeyed through Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, and even succeeded in entering the Great Mosque in Damascus. In 1807, at the age of 20, he was posted to Bombay, but the East India Company soon realized it was a waste to keep a man who spoke half a dozen Arabic languages in India, which is how he came to find himself in Baghdad. One day, when in nearby Mosul, on the banks of the Tigris, he heard about some interesting sculptures that had been found in a mound across the river, but the local Muslim priest had ordered them to be destroyed as works of the devil, and not a trace remained. This is what provoked Rich to start searching among those volcano-like mounds, for he was convinced that one of them concealed the ruins of Nineveh. Unfortunately, he was not sure which. At least he thought he knew where to look for the ruins of ancient Babylon. This was at a place called Birs Nimrud. I guess that's how you pronounce that, where the ruins of the Tower of Babel were still to be seen, towering 235 feet above the plain. Rich studied these and wrote his Memoir of the Ruins of Babylon, which came out in 1815 and made him famous. Suddenly, all Europe became excited about ancient ruins. Rich had little time to enjoy his fame, for he caught cholera in Shiraz and died in 1820 at the age of 33. He never knew that the place he thought was Babylon was actually the ancient city of Borsippa. But Rich was correct about one thing, the whereabouts of Nineveh. 20 years later, the French consul at Mosul was a doctor named Paul-Émile Botta. He was a linguist and a scholar, and took a lively interest in those academic and philosophical disputes, which, then as now, divided French intellectuals into warring camps. Ever since Napoleon had taken archaeologists with him to Egypt to study its pyramids and temples, the French had been archaeology mad, particularly since a young genius named Champollion had succeeded in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics by means of the Rosetta Stone. Botta had recently been following a dispute about the whereabouts of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians, where Sennacherib and Assurbanipal had struck terror into the hearts of their neighbors. Amazingly, it seemed to have vanished without a trace, but one suggestion was that it had been in the region of Mosul. Botta found his consular duties less than absorbing, and Mosul itself a typical Arab city full of dust and noise. He began to make a habit of riding out at evening to enjoy the breeze along the river, and the desert with its mysterious mounds. He also bought pieces of ancient pottery and inscribed fragments of clay tablets from local Arabs, and one day he decided to start digging at a village called Kuyunjik, where there was a promising-looking mound. As month after month went by without any find more significant than broken pottery and clay tablets, Botta began to suspect he was wasting his time and money. The local Turkish pasha, Mesopotamia was then ruled by the Turks, was also made life difficult by spying on the excavation and intimidating the workmen, convinced that the French consul was in search of treasure. Botta was about to abandon archaeology when a persuasive Arab told him that he ought to try his village, where he would find plenty of ancient bricks and pottery. Boda needed little persuasion to take his workmen to a village called Khorsabad, 7 miles to the north. There they sank a shaft and soon came upon a wall lined with slabs of stone, on which there were drawings of animals. Boda had no doubt that he had found Nineveh. Actually, he was wrong. He had discovered the palace of a king named Sargon II, who ruled around 700 BC. The palace proved to be immense, with about 200 rooms, and friezes of bearded men, warriors on horseback, and winged animals. Boda might not have discovered Nineveh, but he had discovered ancient Assyria. And why did they need to be rediscovered? Because for 3 centuries, from 911 BC until 610 BC, the Assyrians had hacked and slaughtered their way to power with such ferocity that their enemies finally banded against them and killed them like vermin, reducing their cities to charred rubble. 2 centuries later, the Greek mercenaries of King Cyrus passed the vast ruins of Nineveh and Nimrud, and the story is told by the historian Xenophon, and marveled at these gigantic empty ruins. But the local inhabitants could tell them nothing about the devastated cities. Even the memory of the Assyrians had been destroyed. In 1842, Boda met a young Englishman named Henry Layard, who had been dreaming about the Middle East ever since he heard the Arabian Nights as a boy. The two often shared a pipe together, sometimes of opium, and when Boda showed him the mound of Kuyunjik, Layard seems to have been bitten by the bug of archaeological research, which is something in common with the gambler's love of backing long odds. Layard had no money, but he had a persuasive tongue, and 3 years later succeeded in introducing the English ambassador in Constantinople, inducing the British ambassador in Constantinople to give him £60. With that he began excavating yet another mysterious mound, that of Nimrud, Kala, and unearthed finds even more spectacular than Boda's, huge winged lions and bulls that were soon on their way back to the British Museum. Now famous and financed parsimoniously by the British Treasury, Layard turned his attention to Kuyunjik, which had defeated Boda a few years earlier, and within hours he realized how close the Frenchman had come to making one of the most momentous finds in the history of archaeology. For this indeed was Nineveh, the great city of the Bible, and Layard was soon digging into the burnt-out palace of Assurbanipal, 669 to 626 BC, one of its mightiest and most ruthless kings. By now, the French were back in the race, and the mound of Kuyunjik was divided between them. But one day, in 1852, when the French were absent, Layard's assistant, Hormuzd Rassam, decided to do a little poaching and ordered his workmen to tunnel into the French territory on the other side of the dividing line. The god of archaeology was with him, and he cut through a wall and found himself in the library of Assurbanipal, full of clay tablets inscribed with wedge-like cuneiform. On one of these was the 15-digit number that would so excite Maurice Chatelain more than a century later. I think he mentioned that, and I can't remember what they call that number. He had mentioned it in an earlier chapter. Now it so happened that Assurbanipal is, in spite of being one of the cruelest tyrants in history, was an enthusiastic collector of written records. Whenever he conquered a city, he had its library transported to Nineveh. As a result, he had collected some 30,000 clay tablets, mostly concerned with magic, exorcism, and divination. Layard had them sent back to the British Museum. At the time, no one could read cuneiform writing, although a British officer named Henry Rawlinson had made an important start by copying an inscription on a cliff near Behistun in Persia. It had been carved there by the Persian king Darius and was in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, which was more or less Assyrian. And in 1857, Rawlinson published his first translations from the Assyrian language. By this time, he had returned to England and was working for the British Museum, and a young man named George Smith, a banknote engraver who was interested in archaeology, came to work for him. It was in 1872 when George Smith was pondering over the vast pile of clay tablets sent by Hormuzdrasam that he suddenly realized that he had something rather more important than some old treatise on reading entrails. He came upon the statement that a ship came to rest on the mountains of Nazir, followed by an account of how a dove was sent out in search of dry land. It was obviously a fragment of the story of the flood. As Smith continued piecing together the fragments of 11 tablets that seemed to belong together, it dawned on him that he had stumbled on a major literary work, an epic about a hero named Gilgamesh, and what was so exciting was that this was much earlier than any known work in the history of world literature, at least 1,000 years older than the Bible or the works of Homez. How did I see that as a Z? Homer. Sorry about that. As he continued piecing together this story of Gilgamesh, it became clear to him that it was incomplete. He was missing an important part of the flood story and the conclusion of the narrative. Smith's announcement that he had discovered a version of the flood that was even older than the Bible account caused widespread excitement. Soon the Daily Telegraph offered £1,000 to anyone who could find the missing fragment, and Smith took up the offer. What followed is one of the most famous stories in archaeology. Smith went to the mound of Kuyunjik, and his workmen began digging. Even confining his search to the library, there seemed as little chance of finding it as a needle in a haystack. Every day his workmen found plenty of broken fragments of terracotta with cuneiform inscriptions, but not what he was looking for. Then on the 5th day he brushed the earth off a fragment and instantly recognized that it contained 17 lines that had been missing from the flood story. He telegraphed his success to the newspaper and returned to England in triumph. Soon the British were able to read the story of a hero whose deeds had first been recounted in the Sumerian language before the building of the Great Pyramid. This epic in 12 tablets told the story of the young hero Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, Erech, the capital of Sumeria, also called Sumer, who behaved like a juvenile delinquent. Quote, his lust leaves no virgin to her lover, neither the warrior's daughter nor the wife of the noble. Yet this man is supposed to be the shepherd of the city, wise, comely, and resolute. End quote. The gods themselves complained to Aruru, the goddess of creation, and begged her to make a hero who would be as savage and untamable as Gilgamesh. She obliged by creating a wild man named Enkidu, who lived in the wilderness with the cattle and ate grass. One day a trapper saw Enkidu at the waterhole and was frozen with terror. But when he told his father, the old man was delighted. This sounded like the kind of man who could subdue Gilgamesh. So he told the trapper to go and fetch a harlot from the Temple of Love and take her to the waterhole. The next time Enkidu came to drink with the animals, the trapper told her, quote, bare your breast and go and seduce him, end quote. And nothing loath, she stripped off her clothes and was soon teaching Enkidu the arts of love. After 7 days he was so sexually exhausted that he had lost his swiftness. Now the harlot invited him to come with her to Uruk. Soon they encountered a man who was complaining that Gilgamesh had forced his way into an assembly where a bride was being chosen and insisted on being the first to take her virginity. That night, as the bride was lying in bed, waiting for her husband, Gilgamesh entered the house. At that moment, Enkidu stuck out his foot and tripped him up. The two heroes hurled themselves at one another like raging bulls. and the house shook. But eventually Gilgamesh threw Enkidu, who sat up from the ground and said, quote, "There is not another like you in the world," end quote. Whereupon the two embraced and became sworn friends. The next chapter of the epic described how they went off together in search of the adventure and slew the giant Humbaba, a demon guardian of the forest. On their return, the goddess Ishtar, the Babylonian Venus, falls in love with Gilgamesh. Unwisely, he rejects her, declaring that she will turn against him as she has turned against all her lovers. In a bitter rage, she goes to her father Anu, chief of the gods, and asks him to make her a bull. This animal is so formidable that it can kill hundreds of men with a single snort. But together Enkidu and Gilgamesh slay it. This angers Anu, who says that one of the two heroes must be destroyed. Enkidu is stricken with sickness and dies. Gilgamesh becomes almost insane with grief, and when he recovers, he sets out in quest of immortality, for although his mother is a goddess, has inherited mortality from his father, who is a priest. After a long journey, he finds Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, to whom the gods have granted eternal life, and it is then in the 11th tablet that Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, of how the gods decided to destroy mankind but chose Utnapishtim to survive because he was virtuous. Like Noah, he was told to build a ship that is 6 stories high and to make it waterproof with pitch, then to take aboard all his family and servants, as well as each of the beasts of the field. Then the rains began, and all the rest of mankind was drowned. After 7 days and nights the flood subsided. The ship came to rest on a mountain top, and Utnapishtim sent out first a dove, then a swallow, then a raven in search of dry land. When the raven failed to return, Utnapishtim knew the flood had subsided. In gratitude, Utnapishtim offered incense to the gods. They in turn granted him immortality. In the final part of the epic, Gilgamesh dives under the sea and finds the plant of eternal life. But while he is bathing in a well of cool water, a serpent steals the flower of immortality, echoing the Garden of Eden story, and Gilgamesh, weary and worn out with labor, finally dies. Although this story of Gilgamesh was probably sung by minstrels before 3000 BC, long before it was written down, it was translated into many Middle Eastern languages and is known in several versions. The Gilgamesh epic made George Smith famous, a celebrity that would be cut short 3 years later when he died of a virus contracted in Aleppo on his way to Mesopotamia. By that time he had discovered more tablets in Ashurbanipal's library with an account of the creation of the world, whose similarities to the story in Genesis was as striking as those of the flood story. For this was what created the worldwide interest, the notion that the Bible stories might simply be a later version of Sumerian originals. The believers could feel that these stories brought the truth of the Bible closer to the Victorian sitting room, while the skeptics, or as they preferred to call themselves in the Victorian age, agnostics, could classify the Bible and the Epic of Gilgamesh together as ancient fictions. Smith made everybody happy. The discoveries of Botta, Laird, and Rawlinson had started a landslide of interest in ancient Mesopotamia. One obvious candidate for exploration was another typical desert mound at a spot about 20 miles north of the port of Basra. The Arabs called it Tel al-Mukayyar, meaning the mound of pitch. It stands in a bare, flat region with little shelter from sandstorms. And in 1854, 2 years after Rassam had found the library of Assurbanipal, a British civil servant named J.E. Taylor was sent by the British Foreign Office to look at the mound on behalf of the British Museum. Taylor was not an archaeologist and was totally inexperienced in judging historical constructions. As far as he could see, it was a kind of square building, which might have been a palace, and three more square structures stuck on top so it rose like a step pyramid. When news of it reached civilization, there would be no speculation that this was the original Tower of Babel. Taylor crawled up and down it, disturbing the owls that had been nesting there for centuries, studied the base carefully, looking for some kind of access, then finally smashed his way into its center and found that it was solid. After that, he decided to start at the top. It was a stupid and disastrous decision, whose effect could only have been completely destructive. It was as if some future archaeologist decided to excavate St. Paul's Cathedral by smashing in the dome. The top layers of the mound were simply torn apart as if by a wrecking crew, and the only discoveries that came to light were a few clay cylinders covered with wedge-like cuneiform. Taylor was disgruntled and disappointed, unaware that he was looking at some of the first writing in human history. For the mound at Al-Makayr was in fact Ur of the Chaldees, the legendary home of the patriarch Abraham and the capital city of the Sumerians, who had founded the first great civilization in the Middle East sometime around 4000 BC. Who were these Sumerians who invented writing nearly 6,000 years ago? No one knows. Their origin is a complete mystery. Their language is unlike any other language in the Middle East, neither Indo-European nor Semitic. One authority, as we shall see later, believes they came from a land drowned by floods not far from China. We only know that when historians talk about the beginning of civilization, they speak of the land of Shinar, or Sumer. One archaeologist, Samuel Kramer, even wrote a remarkable book called History Begins at Sumer. Taylor continued vandalizing Ur for 2 more years, then went home, blissfully unaware that future generations of archaeologists would curse his memory. For Taylor had not merely despoiled and mutilated one of the most important sites in ancient history, he had also cleared the way for crowds of Arabs who came to Al-Makayr to take the hard-baked bricks for their own buildings. It was fortunate that their transport consisted of mules and camels rather than tractors and trailers. During the next 3/4 of a century, the ziggurat of Ur ceased to look like a step pyramid and became merely a truncated tower. This was all quite inexcusable because in the days of George Smith, Henry Rawlinson had translated some of the clay cylinders sent back by Taylor and had learned that the tower had been built by someone named Ur-Nammu. That first syllable aroused his interest. The book of Genesis mentions that the father of Abraham took his family away from a city called Ur of the Chaldees. Could this battered tower be part of the biblical Ur? And indeed, time would reveal that it was just that. Appropriately, it was a clergyman's son who was appointed by the British Museum to go and excavate in 1922, before the First World War. Leonard Woolley had dug at Karchemish in Syria with an assistant named T.E. Lawrence, who would soon become famous as Lawrence of Arabia. To the untrained eye, the site of Al-Makayr looked utterly unpromising. When the joint British and American expeditions arrived there in 1923, around the half-ruined tower stretched the flat, biscuit-colored desert broken by a number of mounds. But Woolley was an archaeological detective whose powers of deduction rivaled Sherlock Holmes, and he knew he was looking at the ruins of a fortified city that had been surrounded by fields of corn and barley, intersected by canals that glittered in the blinding sun. The problem was to uncover the temples and palaces and houses that had once been the center of this prosperous region in the days when the Middle East had been green. The first step was to dig trenches. Even in December, at the coolest time of year, this raised clouds of dust that drifted like the smoke of bonfires. The head of the Persian Gulf was one of the hottest summer climates in the has one of the hottest summer climates in the world. First they uncovered pottery, then the remains of buildings. 5 temples grouped in a semicircle around the ziggurat. There were the remains of fountains in the courtyards and water troughs coated with bitumen. The sheer number of buildings buried under the sandy soil made it clear that this excavation would go on for many years. Just outside the temple area, there was an ancient graveyard, probably dating to 3000 BC. The bodies had been buried with some of their possessions, bowls, jugs, and tools, revealing that these people believed they could find use for their possessions in the afterlife. Below the graves were tombs that were obviously of nobles, and here the finds were more sinister. Outside one stone vault they found 2 ox-drawn carts, with the skeletons of the oxen still in the shafts. Inside the carts were the bones of the drivers, and by the skulls of the oxen lay the bones of the grooms. Inside the tomb lay the skeletons of soldiers with copper helmets and spears beside them. In another tomb, identified as that of Queen Shubad, they found skeletons of the court lying in 2 parallel rows, and the skeleton of a harpist whose harp had been broken by the wooden bier of the queen crouched the skeletons of 2 ladies in waiting. It seemed that in ancient Ur, kings and queens, or nobles and their wives, expected to be escorted into the other world by their servants, and since there was no sign of struggle, Woolley had to assume that the servants went willingly, perhaps taking some kind of drug before they were left to suffocate. The queen's tomb was full of rich gifts, including 2 model boats, one of silver, one of copper, each 2 feet long. There was also a headdress, a wig decorated with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and other gold, and with gold rings, beech leaves, and flowers. Woolley's wife, Kate, a talented if domineering lady, whose temperament probably had much in common with Queen Shubad's, modeled and painted a clay head of the queen, which rivals the bust of Nefertiti in the Cairo Museum. 3 years into the dig, Woolley and his co-workers could look down on the old city of Ur with its narrow alleyways and 2-story houses that revealed the prosperity of its citizens. Most houses of the period had only 1 story. Arched doorways were common, although they were not known in Europe until after the time of Alexander the Great. It looked as if Ur had been a city of the well-off middle classes who lived in spacious villas with many rooms. The team had excavated a huge pit 200 feet wide and 40 feet deep. The soil was mostly rubbish and ashes from old fires. A refuse pit 40 feet deep suggested that its contents had accumulated over a very long period, perhaps centuries. Apparently, the inhabitants had thrown their household waste from the top of the town wall, but rubbish is mostly undatable, so in 1929, in the 6th year of the dig, Woolley decided to sink a number of shafts to see if he could find something he could date. He soon came upon a discovery that electrified him. Quote, "Suddenly the character of the soil changed. Instead of the stratified pottery and rubbish, we were in perfectly clean clay, uniform throughout, the texture of which showed that it had been laid there by water. The workmen thought we had come to the bottom of everything, to the river silt of which the original delta was formed." End quote. But they were wrong, for after almost 9 feet of clean clay, they were back in layers of rubbish, but this time full of stone implements. It was obvious that they were now in a more primitive age, an age that had been brought to an end by a great flood. Yet the presence of a fire-baked brick showed that they were not looking at evidence of some early village of mud brick. What had been submerged by the flood was a town. Woolley's announcement that he had discovered evidence of the biblical flood made headlines all over the world, and the book he dashed off in a few months, Ur of the Chaldees, and published that December, sold more than any archaeological book in history. That was not because people were interested in archaeology, it was because Woolley was telling them that the Bible was true. 20 years later, an eccentric scholar named Immanuel Velikovsky created the same effect with Worlds in Collision, in which he claimed that a comet torn out of Jupiter had swept past the Earth and caused the collapse of the walls of Jericho and the parting of the Red Sea. And in 1956, Werner Keller's The Bible as History had the same worldwide success as it surveyed the scientific evidence for stories from the fall of the Sodom and Gomorrah to the Star of Bethlehem. But was Woolley's flood the flood of Genesis? There are reasons for thinking not. To begin with, there are similarities between the culture found above the clay level and the culture found below it, like the baked brick. So this flood had not wiped out civilization, even though Woolley estimated that it covered an area 400 by 200 miles, extending from the Persian Gulf to the north of modern Baghdad. It was still basically a local flood. The archaeologist Max Mallowan, the husband of Agatha Christie, had excavated at Nineveh in 1931 and 32 and again found evidence of a flood. He estimated that this had taken place round about 3500 BC and was probably the flood talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which George Smith assumed to be the flood of the Bible, but Nineveh fell within the area covered by Woolley's flood. So again, it looked like some local flood rather than the great biblical inundation. Then in the mid-1990s, two American scientists, Bill Ryan and Walter Pittman, startled the world of archaeology by advancing a wholly new candidate for the Great Flood, the Black Sea. Before we speak of this, it is necessary to explain that the Mediterranean has not always existed. A mere 20 million years ago, Africa and Europe had not yet joined together, and Africa was an island. When Africa began to move northwards until 7 million years ago, it collided with Europe, trapped the Mediterranean between the tectonic plates, and since there were not enough rivers flowing into it, the sun gradually evaporated the water until it virtually disappeared. The Mediterranean became a sun-dried basin full of cracked mud and sand. That I have never heard. About 5.5 million years ago, the Atlantic began to break through at a point we now call Gibraltar, where Spain and North Africa face one another. It must have been one of the greatest waterfalls in the world's history, about 50 times higher than Niagara, and the volume of water that poured down was 1,000 times greater. In a few years, the Straits of Gibraltar had appeared. Oddly enough, no one suspected how recently the Mediterranean had appeared until 1970. Bill Ryan was on board a research vessel called the Glomar Challenger, which was studying core samples from the sea bottom for evidence of reversals in the Earth's magnetic field, and they began bringing up samples that were pure salt, long tubes of hard-packed sea salt. These left no doubt that the Mediterranean had once dried out, leaving salt flats. Then the sea had suddenly poured in. Scientists at first found this hard to accept, but the evidence was overwhelming. A year later, Ryan was sitting with Walter Pittman, an oceanographer, and a young English researcher named John Dewey. And when Ryan told him about the great Mediterranean Niagara, Dewey remarked unthinkingly that perhaps this might explain the flood legends, until it struck him that all this took place long before man's appearance on Earth. But as Ryan went on talking about the flood, Dewey, half-jokingly, challenged him to try and find the evidence. This was the start of Ryan and Pittman's investigation. Both Ryan and Pittman had studied the Epic of Gilgamesh at college, and this was an obvious starting point. When they looked at it again, they noted that when Gilgamesh goes in search of Pishtim, he walks in the direction of the setting sun. Now, if Gilgamesh lived in Uruk, which was then much closer to the seashore of the Persian Gulf, then we might suppose that he would go south to look for evidence of the flood, not west. Woolley's flood was confined to the land of the two rivers, which run north-south, or at least northwest to southeast. What Ryan and Pittman were looking for was a repetition of what happened when the Atlantic broke through at Gibraltar, but far more recent in date. It required a bottleneck, like the Straits of Gibraltar, which had been sealed when then was washed open by the sea. There was only one obvious candidate in the Mediterranean area, the Black Sea, which lies north of Turkey. This is separated from the Mediterranean by the narrow stretch of water called the Bosphorus. And this is where Ryan and Pittman felt it would be worth looking for their answer to Dewey's challenge. The Black Sea is shaped like a mile-deep salad bowl. The fresh water that flows into it from rivers like the Danube, the Dniester, and the Dnieper flows over its top layer on its way to the Mediterranean, and the bottom of the salad bowl lies heavy and concentrated salt water, rather like that of the Dead Sea. This prevents the sea from breathing and explains why it is a dark green color. Compared with the azure of the Mediterranean, it is relatively lifeless, which also explains why it is sometimes known as the Sea of Death. And it was the fact that Gilgamesh is also recorded as going off in search of the Sea of Death that strengthened Ryan and Pittman's conviction that they were on the right track. As long ago as 1680, an Italian scientist named Luigi Marsili had discovered that the Black Sea has two currents, one on the surface and one far below. Ryan and Pittman repeated his experiment. This consisted in lowering a basket of stones into the water on a very long rope, with a float which would prevent it from sinking to the bottom. And at a certain point, as the basket encountered the undersea current flowing the other way, the float began to move north instead of south. If Ryan and Pittman were right, this northward current had started to flow about 9,000 years ago, when the Black Sea, then a freshwater lake, was invaded by a waterfall from the rising Mediterranean. Some of their colleagues were skeptical about the waterfall theory. They were willing enough to believe that the Black Sea had been topped up by the Mediterranean, but they believed it had probably been a very gradual process, perhaps taking centuries. There was a minor problem about researching the flood theory: the Russians. The Black Sea was full of their ships and naval equipment, and they were understandably concerned in case scientific expeditions funded by the Americans were also intent on spying. Things began to improve with the end of the Cold War in 1990, but it was not until March 19, 1993 that Ryan and Pittman had their first real breakthrough. It was in the form of a letter from a Bulgarian named Petko Dimitrov, and it informed them that he had convincing evidence that 9,750 years ago, the Black Sea level was about 100 meters lower than it is today. Investigating the Black Sea in a submersible, a miniature submarine, Dimitrov had discovered an ancient beach 110 meters below the surface. The fact that it was fossilized proved that it had been submerged by a flood. If the sea rise had been gradual, the lapping waves would have eaten away the beach. Soon after, a second piece of luck came their way: an invitation to join an expedition to the Black Sea, mounted by the Shirtsov Institute of Oceanology in Moscow. They wanted to know whether the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine had contaminated the Black Sea. The Russians had made another interesting discovery. North of the Black Sea, on the other side of the 4-mile wide strait, there is the Sea of Azov, sticking out of the Black Sea like a misshapen bubble. The Russians had planned to build a railway bridge across the strait and had drilled down under the water to test the depth of the bedrock. But below the sediment on the bottom, they found a chasm that plunged another 200 feet. This undersea gorge must have been cut by a river, probably the Don, which now flows into the north of the Sea of Azov. What this meant was that the Sea of Azov had once been dry land, with the Don flowing across it into the small Ice Age lake that is now the Black Sea. So Ryan and Pittman set sail on a Russian ship called the Aquanaut, and had a chance at last to study the bottom of the Black Sea. What worried them basically was the view held among Russian specialists that there had been no flood as such, that what had happened was simply that the Black Sea had risen gradually due to meltwater from the north, while the Mediterranean had also risen because of the melting ice of the last ice age, so that when the two finally mingled there was no gigantic waterfall, but merely a slow rise above the dam that separated them. Their Black Sea cruise gradually made this seem less and less likely. The highly sophisticated Russian equipment showed them the old beaches and riverbeds that were now drowned under salt water, and cores from the bottom showed a very clear distinction between hard mud that had been dried out by the sun and soft black mud on top of it, with the old mud actually looked dried out, and at the junction of the two were Mediterranean crustacea that had been carried in by a waterfall. Former lagoons and swamps still released trapped gas from decaying vegetation, so there could be no doubt there had been a sudden flood just like the one that had turned the dry Mediterranean into a sea 5 or 6 million years ago. Pittman's computations showed that it had been equal to about 250 Niagaras, and that the current had been flowing from the Mediterranean at a swift and dangerous 60 miles an hour. Almost there. A television program Ryan and Pittman made for the BBC presented it all with graphic impact. How local inhabitants at the site of the Black Sea freshwater lake might have been wandering along the intervening land barrier and one day noticed a trickle of water splashing down the cliff. When they tried drinking it, they found it was salty. By the following year, the flow was twice as strong. Then it turned into a gushing stream, which made the barrier crumble fast, and caused a rise in the water level of perhaps a foot a day. They would have had to move quickly northward at a rate of a mile a day to keep ahead of the rising flood, and finally, on high ground, they would turn to look back on a drowned land. These facts had been established beyond doubt by Ryan and Pittman. There was a great flood that turned a small ice age lake into the Black Sea. But when? Dimitrov had hesitated that it had estimated that it had happened about 9,750 years ago, based on the carbon dating of mollusk shells. But when the shells were carbon dated in an American laboratory, Ryan and Pittman were in for a shock. Ryan especially, since he had already given a lecture proposing a date somewhere in excess of 9,000 years ago, say 7,000 BC. But the carbon dating wondered when that was going to happen. But the carbon dating showed he was about 1,500 years out. The flood had taken place around 5,450 BC. This date confused everybody, including myself, when I first watched the BBC program. I had been hoping that the flood would be dated about 12,000 years ago, around the date of Plato's Atlantis. To discover that it came about 5,000 years later was puzzling. For Ryan and Pittman, the result had its consolations. At that date, it could be the flood described in Gilgamesh and Genesis. Admittedly, Woolley and Malawan had placed it much later, but men have long memories, and perhaps this flood had been preserved in the songs of minstrels long before writing existed. Ryan and Pittman even suggested that perhaps the Sumerians were the survivors of the Black Sea flood who had brought their knowledge of irrigation channels with them from the days when the Black Sea was a freshwater lake that steadily shrank in size. Most of their colleagues inevitably thought that that was going too far. Surely the natural place for survivors to flee would be northward, not south to Mesopotamia. In reply, Ryan pointed out that when, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh travels to the Sea of Death in search of Utanapishtim, he is transported over the sea by a boatman who lowers a basket of stones into the water, precisely as Ryan had done on the Black Sea to contact the underlying current. In the BBC program, Stephanie Daly, an expert on Mesopotamian myth and the Epic of Gilgamesh, dismissed this as pure fantasy, declaring that Gilgamesh is so full of amazing stories that it is impossible to use it as a guidebook to modern Mesopotamia. She also points out that the Black Sea flood happened about 2,000 years before the Sumerians began building Ur, or sometime after 4000 BC. Oh, okay. They built Ur 4000 BC. Yet a piece of research conducted in the 1980s seems to indicate that Ryan and Pittman were basically correct, whether or not the author of Gilgamesh was talking about the Black Sea flood or a flood further south. In the Caribbean near Barbados, it had been noticed that the coral, which is normally only a few yards below the surface, was tens of yards below. That meant that the sea level had been rising steadily since the reef was laid down several thousand years ago. In 1988, Rick Fairbanks of the Lamont Doherty Geological Observatory began to take core samples from these coral reefs. The first cores came to the surface just before Thanksgiving 1988. These showed that there had not been there had these showed that there had been not one flood but three. And that is the end of the chapter. And that wasn't so bad, as long as I kept my throat moist. And I tried talking in a lower tone. I hope everybody could understand me fairly well. This mic seems to do a pretty good job of picking up, so hopefully you didn't have to crank your volume too much to hear me. But I tried to keep my voice volume down to spare my voice, and it seems to have worked. So, yeah, I'm going to keep that up. But that will end this reading session. We will, I don't know if I'm going to go back to everyday reading right now. Not sure I'm quite ready for that. I'll see how my voice feels tomorrow night. But yeah, I'm going to take a break, end this stream, and I'll come back in a short bit for Fallout 3. So, I'll see you there.